We've been talking about art and science in the context of wine. There are art and science questions about consuming wine as well as producing it. One is about decanting and passing wine into a carafe, which Bruce is going to explain after I finish or after our break. The art and science of producing stemware is another thing that mixes art and science. And of course, there's the complex topic of pairing wine with food. So looking at what any of us might view as an act of connoisseurship, such as serving a wine at just the right temperature, cutting the capsule at just the right spot, choosing the single instant when the wine is at its peak to serve to your guests. Any of these heroic acts could conceivably be viewed by another human being as quackery, elitism, snobism, or chicanery. But we know better in this group. And so this is a talk about rules, habits, and pretension. And I'll talk in particular about the spate of books about how to drink wine. Oh, I'm sorry. That were written in France between the world wars, particularly a didactic 1927 rule book called Monseigneur le Vin, l'art de boire, the art of drinking, by Louis Forêt, that he said was written explicitly for someone he calls the civilized drinker, who concentrates on every aspect of the wine and also explicitly not aimed for the casual consumer, who he's fairly disdainful of. The implication is that whether wine is art or science, the consumer himself is an artist and consumption is an art. So we're back to Caravaggio. The vast literature of wine, from Bacchus, pictured here as we saw yesterday by Caravaggio, to the Bacchae of Euripides, to the Kiddush cup, the Song of Songs, the rivers of wine in the paradise of Omar Khayyam, the New Testament parables of the vineyard, chapter 15 of John the Evangelist, I am the vine, or in French, I am the cep, the thick part of the vine, and you are the sermon, the little branches. All prepare the way for the feelings of awe and reverence that many people feel in connection with wine and its paired foods. And I thought, as we saw this picture yesterday, this is a distinguished Bacchus as connoisseur, not a reveler. He has ambiguous and intriguing stemware. It's a little hard to see exactly what that is. I encountered another connoisseur earlier this month, all alone in an empty room in Amsterdam. This was at the magnificent exhibit that's going on right now. That's a Frans Hals retrospective at the Rijksmuseum. At other moments, this room was really crowded, but somehow I stumbled on it when I was the only one there. And the man portrayed here, said to be a civic guardsman and known as the happy drinker, seems to focus more on pure pleasure than connoisseurship. Though this was the period in the 17th century when Dutch wine connoisseurship, as both Henry and I have talked about yesterday, was at a high point. The art of purchasing wine and thus influencing the producers the Dutch science that drained and stabilized the coastal Médoc. The happy drinker also, there he is, happy. And he has his special glass, which by not modern standards is not so special. But did this man feel any less pleasure from his glass than does the modern connoisseur or snob who carefully chooses whether to use a Gabrielle glass or Zalto? And has his roast lamb with Chateau Aubailly. Most everyone in this room, I think, subscribes to the rule detailed in the article I handed out yesterday, that rare red meat demands red wine. That's a rule that's part of a gastronomic ritual. But it's only a ritual among people who actually drink red wine and eat red meat, rare meat. UNESCO recognized this pairing in 2010 as an example of the intangible culture of humanity worthy of preservation. Now, UNESCO has been adding more and more things like this to its list. It's an official rule of the United Nations. It's completely unenforceable. If we say that a rule only needs to be followed by those who follow the rule, does that make it not really a rule? I don't think so, because many religious and dietary rules, or rules about dress and fashion, are followed only by the people who follow them. And as happens with many of those rules, following the rules actually reinforces the importance of the rule among those who believe. And the concept of pairing specific wines with specific foods is only 2 or 3 centuries old. The modern dichotomy between red and white wine is also not as old as we might think, and that accounts for some of the ambiguity of the colors of wines in some of the paintings that Henry showed. The earliest rules of wine drinking were implicit. I mentioned when some of us were talking about what business casual means the other day, that the young lawyers at my law firm are astonished when I tell them that there was no dress code when I began working at a law firm. Why was there no dress code? Everyone knew what they were supposed to wear. You could just look at what the other people were wearing, and it was really very specific. Now, dress codes in businesses are pages long and have different dress codes for different days of the week and things like that. But an awful lot of rules are not written down because they're accepted. And that's why it's hard for scholars of etiquette to know exactly what people were doing, because even etiquette manuals don't cover everything, because so many things are so obvious that they don't need to be written down. In many cases, there are different rules in different countries. Somewhat different practices developed among the aristocrats of Bordeaux in London's men's clubs, where wine connoisseurship became very fashionable. And as I say in this paper I distributed, the one rule, since people now drink red wine with fish, and have all kinds of things that would have been frowned on some decades ago. The only rule that's really left standing is red wine with red meat. Now, here's Hugh Johnson looking as happy as the happy drinker, and he has actually criticized some of the arcane English rules about how to approach wine, and he compared them to an episode in Jonathan Swift's book, Gulliver's Travels, where several wars are fought and people die over a decree about which end of a soft-boiled egg should sit at the top of an egg cup. And that egg cup was actually the theme or logo for the conference I spoke at last year, where I presented that paper. I think we always need to keep that Gulliver metaphor in mind when we hear somebody arguing a little too strenuously for a single path to enjoying wine. But is it possible that some of this is snobism? Some people would say this is a class issue or a question of people trying too hard to show refinement, like knowing which fork to use, or using standard accepted grammar, or having a posh accent, or back to the clothing, knowing what to wear. But I think the evidence points against that with this red wine question. And we could think about World War I, when ordinary French soldiers were given a daily ration of a liter of wine. The wine was a sort of Planck wine called Pinard. It would be an understatement to say it was a cheap wine, but it was beloved and plentiful, and in this drawing, the soldier gives it a respectful salute. Later, something's out of order here. Later in the war, the ration was expanded to 2 liters, and Pinard was, by popular opinion, promoted to sainthood. There were signs that said Saint Pinard, and the prized ration to accompany this red wine was meat. On feast days and holidays in the trenches, a finer wine was issued, but only 1 bottle for 4 soldiers. It's a little bit like the different quantities of wines we had yesterday at lunch, depending on what was available and their rarity. There's a French sociologist, or was Pierre Bourdieu, who studied the social origins and judgments of what we call taste, or distinction. And he is known in part for having demonstrated through rigorous surveys that in general, in France, the popular culture of the elites stays 1 step ahead of the general public. But he also observed in his studies of gastronomic preferences that manual workers were more likely to be the guardians of tradition and the true preservationists of the kind of gastronomic culture that UNESCO is seeking to preserve. So elitism or connoisseurship can be 2 ways of looking at the same phenomenon. And this really started to be written down and proselytized about after the horrors of the First World War were over, and a spate of wine rule books aimed at restoring a more civilized world began to emerge. And a prime example is the one I mentioned, the 1927 manual by Louis Forêt. I recently found that it's been translated into English and and reissued by Rizzoli, and I can pass this around later. But it is the art of drinking, about the civilized drinker. And once again, the idea seems to be that whether the production of wine is an art or science, surely the connoisseur is creating art by the way he drinks, if he does it properly. The main character is Monsieur Levin. Well, Monseigneur Levin is the author, supposedly, and then his audience is the civilized drinker. Civilized drinking demands thoughtful preparation. Preparation includes stocking a wine cellar so that the appropriate wine would always be at hand, and Fauré laments that fewer and fewer people even have a wine cellar anymore in 1927. Pouring slowly is important. Mentally preparing before the first sip, and particularly thoughtful evaluation before the first sip. Concentrating on everything about the wine. He's saying this is not a game. Everything is done with great ceremony and a thoroughgoing sense of being far more serious than the war in the trenches. And I do confess that the combination of concentration and seriousness and deep or haunting flavors have always been attractive to me. But beyond expressing a sincere appreciation for their view of civilization, these manuals from the 20s and 30s devolved more than a bit into nationalism and nationalistic pride. And another popular rule book from the same period is by Paul Cassagnac, who was the scion of a long line of Bonapartist nationalists that continues today in some sense. He went on to write a book, in addition to a book about wine. He wrote a book in 1933 with the title Napoleon Pacifist. But he also wrote a wine book. Notice that it's also not addressed to the general public. It's pour les gourmets. And this book is also an expression of his view of French exceptionalism. Early in the book, in passing, he claims to have heard of rich Americans purchasing rare and costly French wines only to mix them with soda water. And in repeating that common legend, he says fairly explicitly that the French alone have a monopoly on savoir-faire, which many of us believe, but he put it in writing. It reminds me, though, of the rumors that we hear today about other groups that somebody might consider less gifted than ourselves in following wine rules. And particularly the claim that an emerging group of Chinese wine connoisseurs are buying Chateau Lafite only to mix it with Coca-Cola. But in both cases, marginalizing entire populations, as I think Cassagnac was doing, um, um, presents the idea that people who are new to connoisseurship and whose presence in the market may drive prices up can't possibly appreciate the wines that they're buying. But I have proof that in the 1930s, Americans were not mixing their wine with soda water. And here's the proof. A cartoon by James Thurber in the New Yorker. Oops. That says, it's a naive domestic Burgundy without any breeding, but I think you'll be amused by its presumption.
That is a domestic Burgundy.
1937.
Right. Right. So another aspect of rules is this marriage. And this book appeared during that same period. The marriage of wine and food. And you see the wine and the food there. The wine is the bride. I don't know why. But we might say that this marriage represents a particularly artistic side of wine. But more recently, a newer approach to wine pairing based on chemistry and what's become known as neuroenology or neurogastronomy has appeared. And that often upends the conventional rules of pairing. And there are two chemists who got into this subject because of work that they were doing with prominent chefs in France and in Spain, who were deeply interested in why certain foods are better than certain wines. And this topic will keep coming up today. The first one is a chemist, Jacques Puisset, who wrote this book in 1985. And he collaborated with Alain Sandron, a chef who was very famous for making just dishes that went perfectly with a particular wine. And he didn't really use received wisdom. He also would select the wine first and make sure he had a sufficient quantity of it, like 20-year-old Chateau Beaucastel. And then he would design a dish specifically for that wine, as if the wine were sort of the sauce. And some of you may have been to meals at Sandron's at that time, and I particularly enjoyed them. And then there's a Canadian scientist, François Chartier, who has this elaborate chart that he used working with Ferran Adrià to explain new wine rules. So I'd like to just finish with going back to where Henry began, and we talked yesterday about the Eucharistic transformation, where wine becomes blood and bread becomes flesh. Blood is, of course, the essence of rare meat. And after all, many of the great vineyards in France, not especially in Bordeaux, were established by monks in the Middle Ages. But the idea that the pairing of red wine with red flesh began with the Eucharist is, as some of you have heard me say before, it's easily refuted because first, the Eucharist is not an ordinary meal. The bread of the Eucharist in no way resembles rare meat. And blood red wine is a product of a much later period. Nevertheless, at another level, long-standing mystical and religious associations with flesh and blood and comparisons of wine, regardless of its color, with blood, are everywhere. And wine, as a mysterious fermented beverage, has been associated with the divine in every culture that's produced wine. Blood and blood sacrifice have similarly deep resonances. The philosopher Roland Barthes wrote a series of celebrated essays emphasizing that beefsteak and frites, but most particularly with red wine, are actually at the essence of French culture and the French psyche. And he said steak participates in the same sanguinary mythology as wine. Whoever eats it assimilates a taurine strength. So we've seen that, here's Velázquez, that some rules, unenforceable rules, are validated by chemistry, by history, by sociology. And with those rituals, the food, the wine, the stemwares, and the decanter become one in ritual marriages repeated at meal after meal. Where wine rules are concerned, I come down on the side of connoisseurship, although there's plenty of quackery to be found. And I think some of that will appear in Bruce's talk. And I haven't found any in these several days. So thank you very much. I've marked a few sections of this book that I think are particularly interesting or funny.
Thank you. And Mazzoli has just printed this?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. I thought it was neat.
The publisher of the book of the marriage and
Oh.
What was interesting was the publisher of the book of the marriage of food and wine with the bride and the groom. It was the Bureau de Moniteur du Vin.
Yeah. And this book was originally published as a promotional book by Nicolas, the wine distributor. But it's it's a real book, and with a then famous illustrator. The drawings are fantastic, I think.
What's the name of the illustrator?
We have that.
Charles Martin.
Yeah, and at the end, when I first saw the book in French, I didn't know anything about him, but
I've seen those illustrations.
yeah, he's known for a lot of publications, including Vogue, that he did illustrations for.
Only they didn't look as drunk in Vogue. Or as happy.
But they followed fashion rules and then broke them in ways to keep one step ahead of the public.